Before I kick off the show, I wanted to give a shout out to Kenny Troiano. Kenny had me on his show Bred to Perfection to talk about how closely breeding is to natural selection. Kenny has both a YouTube channel and a podcast, and they're both amazing resources if you're a breeder or are even considering becoming one. I touched on artificial selection on an earlier episode, but it doesn't scratch the surface. To find out more about what Kenny does, go to breedersacademy.com. I say all this not only because I enjoyed my time on the show with Kenny and Nancy, but also because this episode and the next few were inspired because of our conversation. So thanks, Kenny.
There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
The death of Darwinism has been proclaimed not only from the pulpit, but from the biological laboratory. But, as in the case of Mark Twain, the reports seem to have been greatly exaggerated, since today, Darwinism is very much alive. Those words were written by English biologist Julian Huxley. The book, Evolution, the Modern Synthesis, was published in 1942. And in that book, Huxley sought to save Darwinism from what he called the Eclipse of Darwinism. That period lasted from the 1880s until the 1920s. And it was a time where alternative theories were proposed. And Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection was considered old and somewhat passé. Not something any true scientist or biologist should consider. Now, Huxley knew this to be ridiculous. After all, his own grandfather, Thomas Huxley, was a steadfast supporter of Charles Darwin and his ideas. Thomas Huxley's lack of intimidation and eagerness to debate any and all detractors earned him the nickname Darwin's Bulldog. Darwin, not a man who enjoyed confrontation or debate, quite the opposite in fact, he rarely left home, was more than happy to give Huxley the stage and the sword. So, what was it that kicked off this aversion to natural selection? It wasn't the church at the time, although the church had no problem accepting theories that fit into the church's teachings, which natural selection did not, especially when it came to humanity. Biologists and other academics were quick to hop on board to promote their own pet theories and to knock down Darwin's. Was it professional jealousy? Well, maybe in some cases, but certainly not all. Some simply pointed at the gaps in Darwin's theory and called it incomplete or unfeasible in all situations. Fleming Jenkin, a professor of engineering at the University of Edinburgh, was one of these. In 1867, in an article published in the North British Review, Jenkin reviewed On the Origin of Species and instead pointed to blending inheritance as accounting for the differentiation of species that we see in nature, and others agreed. So what's blending inheritance? To put it simply, and very simply I might add, it's a blending of characteristics from two parents. Recessive and dominant genes or traits weren't known back then, so the idea was a literal blending of traits. If I have a white rose and a red rose, the resulting rose will be pink, according to blending inheritance. If I'm tall and my wife is shorter, our children should be an average between the two of us. Now, the problem was, Darwin knew natural selection was the driver, but he didn't know the internal mechanics within an organism that provided natural selection with the raw material to work with. Again, this was before Mendel's experiments with peas and the later birth of genetics as a science. The mechanism of mutations weren't even known yet. The term wouldn't be coined or even discovered until Dutch botanist Hugo de Vries came up with it after noticing what at first were unexplained variations in the evening primrose. So, not knowing any of this in the mid-19th century, Darwin imagined the body, each part of it, must produce little particles he called gemmules. Now, these particulates were collected and passed on. Even Darwin wasn't completely sold on his own idea, which he called pangenesis, and he was even reluctant to publish anything about it. And he eventually did in his 1868 work, The Variations of Animals and Plants Under Domestication. So how did gemmules become modified? Because they had to be in order to produce a variation. Darwin wondered if a change to a body part during an organism's life accounted for alterations in gemmules. So Jean-Baptiste Lamarck would have stood up and applauded. It was Lamarck who once proposed his theory of inheritance and use and disuse. If I develop muscles during my lifetime, there's a very good chance my offspring will have larger muscles. Well, we know this isn't the case, but what else was Darwin to grasp onto? Science hadn't yet caught up to him. So why did he publish his thoughts on pangenesis anyway? Well, Thomas Huxley urged him to. Huxley wasn't quite sold on the idea, yet he also knew that Darwin's genius might be proven right someday regarding these unseen imagined particles. The declaration of Darwinian evolution's demise came fast and furious at the turn of the century. In 1903, German naturalist Eberhard Dennert wrote that he stood at the deathbed of Darwinism in a book by the same name. In the book's preface, the book immediately revealed its stance, declaring that Dr. Dennert brought together testimonies which leave no room for doubt about the decadence of the Darwinian theory in the highest scientific circles of Germany. Well, no more was evolution thought to be a competitive struggle of life or death. What many biologists and thinkers of the time wanted to see was progress, not a mindless, random force of nature selecting brute strength or cunning over intelligence and beauty, which, of course, nature doesn't do. Nature doesn't select for strength, beauty, or intelligence. None of that really matters. What does matter is the organism's ability to survive in its habitat. Now, I could be an intellectual giant equal to Einstein or Newton, which I'm not, but if the entire northern hemisphere were to suddenly lose power and be plunged into an ice age, I might not stand a chance, whereas some creatures would. They may suffer hardships in the new environment as well, yet they would survive and have offspring, while humanity stumbles along until it can stumble no more. It's not a case of the meek inheriting the earth. It's really a case of the better adapted doing so. This is what natural selection does. So, by the powers of science and technology, we are able today to allow Julian Huxley to sum things up for us.
If I may just very briefly sum up the main points, is we all accept the fact of evolution. We all accept that some combination of mutation and recombination is the raw material for change, and that natural selection is the main directive or directional principle, and that selection is not anything conscious, it's the differential survival through the generations.
Darwinian evolution did come out on the other side of the eclipse Huxley described. When it did, it came out better supported than it was before, with new discoveries such as genetics, mutations, and phenotypes. Under the guidance of Huxley and others, it was brought into what was called a modern synthesis, incorporating many scientific disciplines to support Darwin's theory of natural selection and the diversity of species. Huxley's modern synthesis became a bit convoluted over time, no fault of his own. Others contributed to it as well, long after Huxley, and it became a Frankenstein monster of theories, but the underlying core remained the same. It was Darwinian natural selection. As a result, selection doesn't operate only between individuals or populations.
It also operates in the long term between major groups, classes, even phyla, so that you get this succession of so-called dominant type.
Thank you, Professor Huxley. Now, I haven't done a small connected series of episodes in a few years, so I thought we could have some fun with this. What we're going to look at over the next few episodes are some of the theories which popped up during the Eclipse of Darwinism that sought to supplant it. Things like mutationism and neo-Lamarckism and a couple of others. We'll also look at some that offered alternative theories. Some are older, like vitalism, and some, like intelligent design, are more recent. Now, that's the one thing about theories. There's certainly never a shortage of them when it comes to life, especially in its many wonderful forms here on our little planet. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. It means a lot that you've taken time out of your day to set 10 or so minutes aside to listen. I'm Rick Coast, and you can find show notes and source material and also ways to keep this show alive by going to evolutiontalk.com. I'd love to hear from you. And I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.